Good afternoon, all of you. I welcome you all to this event, which we set the ball rolling today, and which we hope will be the first start of many of events which we plan under this Chinese culture banner. To set the ball rolling, let me invite the director of our Institute of Chinese Studies, Ambassador Shokanta, to place his welcome remarks.
Well, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this seminar on complex belongings, the Chinese Indian community, which is being organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies in collaboration with the India International Center and O.P. Jindal Global University. The idea of organizing an event like this, in fact, originated in a meeting I had several months ago with Air Marshal Naresh Verma, Director of India International Center, who talked about his project of showcasing contributions of relatively small, even minuscule Indian communities to the larger society and culture in India. And both of us agreed that the Chinese community in India would be a fascinating subject for a joint seminar. I would like to thank Air Marshal Naresh Verma, who couldn't join us this afternoon, Ms. Premila Ghosh and other colleagues from the IIC for this joint endeavor, as indeed for several collaborative projects we have undertaken between ICS and IIC in recent months. I would also like to thank Jindal Global University for supporting this event. Now let me clarify, and as you would have already seen from the concept note that we had circulated, when we talk about the Chinese community in India, we don't have in mind the expatriate Chinese community, which is relatively small but growing as we have the expanding footprint of Chinese business in India. What we are discussing is the community of people of Chinese origin, the Chinese diaspora, people who trace their ancestry back to China. And the core idea of this seminar was fleshed out by Tan Sen Sen, Joining Bonaji, Severin Kwok, Nebula Sharma, Madhurima Nandi, and Rinku Bhaumik. This afternoon we are going to explore various facets of this tiny but vibrant community, its past, present and future, its challenges and hopes, and also certain unhappy memories associated with the 1962 conflict with China. We'll also look at niche contributions made by the Chinese community to the local communities and its connections abroad, its search for identity within India and in communities outside the country. We are fortunate that eminent sinologist, Professor Tan Sen Sen, whose outstanding new book, India, China and the World, A Connected History, was launched at IIC, again as a collaborative project between IIC and ICS and OUP in this case, on 12th of this month. Tansen has kindly agreed to provide an overview of the theme and also chair the panel discussion that will follow. While conceptualizing this seminar, I posed a question to Tansen whether the community we are discussing should be described as Chinese Indian or Indian Chinese, and hopefully he will provide an answer to us in his overview in a short while. We have a strong panel today comprising of scholars who have been working on the Chinese Indian community with empathy and understanding, as also scholars and professionals belonging to the community in India. In the latter category, we have Lawrence Liang, currently a professor of law, governance and citizenship at Ambedkar University, who is also a well-known legal activist. Severin Kwok, who is associated with ICS, is doing a PhD work at JNU on the Chinese diaspora. She is a recipient of ICS HYI fellowship. Mr. Bin Ching Law or Benny Law is a renowned architect who is president of Chinese Indian Association for the last 3 years. Journey, I just referred to, teaches at Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities and is currently working on a book on the Calcutta Chinese community and idea of cosmopolitan city. Professor Rita Chaudhary is currently the director of the National Book Trust of India. She is a very well-known Assamese novelist, poet and activist. Her novel Makum, originally written in Assamese, and the English version of which is just going to be released shortly at Jaipur Literary Festival, Chinatown Days, is a critically acclaimed portrayal of Assamese community of Chinese origin. Pia Chakravarti is pursuing her doctoral research at Shiv Nara University on the Indian Chinese community, specifically focusing on food, memory of war, and the relationship with the construction of Indian Chinese subjectivity. I would like to thank Tansen and the panel for putting together this event. We will be discussing a community which is never very large, at best a few tens of thousands. Really, I can't really find the exact number. I've been posing this question to my friends. At present is perhaps not more than 6,000 or thereabouts. About 4,000 or not more than that in Kolkata, I'm told. Maybe another 2,000 outside. But this is again the better informed people in the panel can talk about it later. Its presence in India is linked to the 18th and 19th century Chinese migrations to various parts of Asia, particularly to Southeast Asia. Population pressures, domestic turmoil, and the formation of colonial commercial labor networks caused the migration of the Chinese to the Malaya archipelago and also contributed subsequently to the emergence of Chinese settlements in Kolkata, Mumbai, Siliguri, Kalimpong, Karachi, Colombo and elsewhere. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia in the late 1930s triggered another flow of ethnic Chinese as refugees from Malaya to British India. As our concept paper brings out, the Chinese Indian community formed the largest non-South Asian migrant group in the early years of independent India. Though relatively small, they contributed to local societies through the niches in shoemaking, carpentry, and dentistry businesses and created a new type of cuisine. The community had specializations ranging from the Hakka shoemakers and tannery owners, the Hupenis, dentists, teeth setters and paper flower makers, and the Shantung silk traders. There were also Chinese laundries, restaurants and beauty parlors, which were more ubiquitous but not monopolized by any specific sub-ethnic groups of the Chinese. The post-independence India witnessed major divisions within the community because of the competing pulls and pressures from the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. And the late 1950s, due to the deteriorating relations between India and China, a large segment of the community got trapped in the grey zone of statelessness. Post 1962, thousands of ethnic Chinese were either deported or interned. Severe restrictions were also placed on them with regard to movement and employment. The suffering of the Chinese Indian community, including the internment of some 3,000 men, women and children at Deoli in Rajasthan for up to 5 years, from late 1962 until early 1967, is a particularly unfortunate chapter that we hope to examine up front this afternoon. As a consequence of these developments in migration to Canada and other destinations, the number of Chinese living in India has dwindled, as we discussed earlier. We are looking forward to exploring the fascinating stories and legends of the Chinese communities in India, the way they have contributed to local societies in many different ways, the efforts to preserve the unique identity and cultural heritage, the articulation of their specific challenges within the larger societal concerns, and the links and connections they have forged not only within the country but also with the diaspora communities in Canada and elsewhere. We'll also witness Rafiq Elias's well-known documentary on the Chinese community in India, The Legend of Fat Mama, before the panel discussion. Now I'll invite Professor Tan Sen to provide his keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kanta. I'll just try to open this. Is there somebody working on this? Can you just set this up before? I would like to thank all the participants here. This project on India, China, Indian Chinese community or Chinese Indian community started, I think, 2006 or 7. Your sister Jennifer Liang was very much involved in the initial phases. In fact, I have your uncle's letters that he was writing to South Africa in Nepali, and I got really fascinated with his life as a carpenter on a ship. And Vinny is here somewhere, right, Vinny? Yes, your former Indian Chinese Association director, Paul Chung, was a close friend. But we formed a network to study the Chinese Indian or Indian Chinese community from then on, and I've been looking at some of the Intelligence Bureau files on the community in West Bengal State Archives. Many of the panelists here I know from 2007-2008 journey, and we were trying to educate people about this very small community. As Ambassador Kanta mentioned, a lot is not known about them, and I think a lot needs to be done to understand how they try to fit in and are trying currently to fit into the Indian society. And thus the title Indian Chinese or Chinese Indian is still not very clear. With the rise of China in the recent years, things have again changed, and how this community, mostly in Kolkata, are looking towards China in a different perspective than they did in the 50s and the 60s. So what I will do today is to talk about the title of this event. We call it Complex Belongings. It was certainly a title invented by the geographical person among us, not a historian. But this picture is from a farming village in China. Yeah, if you can dim the lights somewhere so that we can see the beautiful saris and people here. These are the so-called returnees who were deported from India after 62. This is not the first generation of the returnees, this is the second or third generation who celebrate in China Diwali and Holi. This is a Diwali function, and so these are third generation Chinese kids who are wearing saris and celebrating their Indian heritage in China. And this is the
Now we
fascinating
know
these things, right? Mera Naam Chin Chin Chu was a famous song, and you know what is his name? Mei Yang Chang, right? Hubei dentist family. But we don't know much about other things. We know about the food. I think Pia is going to talk about the food, the Hakka noodle, the gobi Manchurian. The rickshaw was introduced by the Chinese to Kolkata, and that is one of their contributions. What we didn't know, and I didn't know earlier on when I started doing, is the limited movement that was placed on the community at the aftermath of India-China war. This document restricting the movement of only the foreign nationals, and here the category of foreign national is quite interesting. Many of these people were actually born in India. They were not given citizenship, and every time they had to move across town, outside the town, they had to get permission from the police station, and this was the beginning of the internment process. And then this is what I got interested in. Where do they fit? Are they foreigners? Are they Indians? Are they Chinese Indians? Or are they Indian Chinese? This is a huge identity issue, and I think we are still struggling with that issue. So the answer to your question is we don't know if they are Indian Chinese or Chinese Indian, and in fact I would say it's more complicated than that. So the complexities of this, so I'll talk about two parts, the complexities part and the belonging part. Where do they actually belong? Here, the question is not about who is Indian Chinese and who is Chinese Indian. The question, which is very complicated, is who is Chinese. This for sociologists and others who are looking at the Chinese migrants and how they define the Chinese. So this is a survey that was done in Singapore, which you know 75% of the people are Chinese. And they were asked, who do you think is a Chinese? And the Singaporeans were saying, if you are not born Chinese, you can't become Chinese. Some others said, I think as long as your face is Chinese, and even if you don't speak Chinese, you are still a Chinese. This is very problematic for the northeastern people of India, right? They look Chinese, but they are not Chinese. And then the last one is, I think interesting, I think Chinese who do not speak Chinese are not really Chinese. So we talk about Indian Chinese, Chinese Indian, here's something called Chinese Chinese. So this issue of who is a Chinese in a foreign setting itself is problematic. So I would like you to understand that when we wrestle with this issue of who is an Indian Chinese or Chinese Indian, the Chinese itself is a term that needs to be examined thoroughly, and it's not clear who that is. Now the reason for that, as we go on, who is a Chinese, we have to look at where these people migrated from. Actually, they are not just Chinese, they are more than Chinese. They are mostly migrating out of southern China, the Guangdong province and the Fujian province, to Southeast Asia. The migration history actually starts around 12th century when we find the earliest writings about the presence of Chinese community in Cambodia. That seems to be during the Song dynasty. Later on during the Ming dynasty, there were more people because of the ban imposed on traders trading with foreigners, that some Chinese started settling in various parts of Southeast Asia. Most of it takes place in the 18th, 19th and early 20th century. And this has to do with the British network. And I think that's a very important part of understanding Chinese migrant network that develops there. They're finding work among the places where the foreigners, the Europeans, have taken over, the Dutch, the British, and they're moving into these colonies of the Europeans. So you find them in Indonesia, Batavia, where the Dutch have their colony. You have them in Malacca, Penang, Singapore, where the British have. And it's through those networks that they reach Kolkata, basically following the British network. But it is important to look at where they're coming from and how they themselves identified before they became the issue of two nation states, China and India. Now, if you really look at these groups, it's not national identities, it's mostly speech identities. What language did they speak? That essentially defined them until later movement during the Republican period, where Mandarin was emphasized as a common language of these people who had migrated from China, that each school in Southeast Asia and even in Kolkata must be taught in Mandarin rather than Cantonese or Hakka. That's basically to bring them into this notion of being Chinese. But initially they were speaking many different languages. Hokkien people from Fujian were some of the earliest migrants outside mainland China. Cantonese, Hakka, Teochew, and Hainanese, these are the speech groups. So there you don't see any Chinese. These are speech groups, and they would identify themselves as a Hokkien speaker or a Cantonese or a Hainanese. And among them, there were various kinds of tensions. I think that's very important to remember. Their heritage was not a Chinese heritage. Their heritage was Cantonese, Hakka, or Hainanese, or whatever speech they spoke. So that's very important to remember. In the initial stages, what differentiated them from themselves, other groups migrating from this region, was this language they spoke. And that is also clear in Kolkata, actually. And I think Vinny and Lawrence would know. Most of the migrants come from Kwangtung province. But Kwangtung province itself is very diverse, and Cantonese itself has many sub-dialects. And so these are two sub-dialects that I have marked. I don't know if you can read that. One is called Kwangfu and one is Sui. So this comes from Chongqing region in Guangdong. These people speak their own Kwangfu sub-dialect of Cantonese. They are different from another Cantonese and the CE region, which is again a sub-dialect of Cantonese. So there is a difference between those we categorize as Cantonese. They themselves would categorize into distinct groups based on sub-dialects. The other community also comes from Kwangtung province, and they speak a totally different language, which is Hakka. And so the differences then present in Kolkata is among the sub-dialect categories and language categories. So even though we see them as Chinese, and that's why it's difficult to answer the question Indian Chinese or Chinese Indian, because the Chineseness of these people is also very complex, and that's what we have to remember, that they placed their distinctions already when they were moving. Now, one of the ways in which these speech identities and local native region identities were emphasized and perpetuated in foreign lands were through various institutions. So you have something called Kungsi, sometimes translated as companies. These were basically a business relationship that existed among a sub-dialect group or associations coming from a particular location. Huikwans, in the same way, is translated as native place association, which you see many of them in Kolkata, are also in the same way there in foreign regions to take care of people who came from a specific region of Kwangtung. So the people from the Kwangfu sub-dialect would have their own native place associations. Those who are Hakkas would have their own, the Hokkienese would have their own. So this is to basically take care of their own people. So the distinction separating these people moving from southern China remain through institution buildings. Societies and clan associations also very narrowly about people who are surnamed Chang would have their own clan association and so forth. And attached to this was their belief system. Temples would be associated. Temples that are very, very localized. You don't find it perhaps beyond the community that speaks a sub-dialect of Cantonese. And this is to basically make sure that in a foreign land, they preserve their local identities that they had in their ancestral homeland. So temples in Chinatown, in Kolkata, for example, serve that important purpose. So if we just categorize them as Chinese, you lose out the important ways in which temples served as protective places for a sub-community where they wanted to separate themselves from other Chinese. This is key also in Toronto that I'll come to. Kolkata Chinese living in Toronto is a different Chinese from coming from Caribbeans, for example. So that distinction had to be maintained through these kinds of institutions. The schools were particularly important. There were about 7 or 8 schools in Kolkata, Chinese schools, and they originally taught in their own sub-dialects, Cantonese, Hakka, and so forth. Later on, during the Republican period, they tried to merge and enforce the use of Mandarin. Earlier on, they were being taught in their local languages. So these institutions, all of which exist in Kolkata, perhaps not the Kungsi, but these other things were basically to preserve these identities which were very, very sub-regional, sub-speech dialect based in Kolkata. And the schools, and we find some of the curriculum, it is not only to preserve their uniqueness, but also to teach them about China. That the curriculum in many of the schools had nothing to do with India. They were using history of China, Chinese language, of course, Hakka or Cantonese, but they were supposed to learn about Chinese geography, Chinese history, and so forth. And the reason was, where did they actually belong? Where is it that they will live? And the most important thing is, where will they go back? So the term that basically was used for these Chinese is that they are temporarily in Kolkata or temporarily in India. They are sojourning in India. The meaning is that they will leave this place and go back. The situation in China was not good, so they were making profit outside, getting a livelihood. The expectation always was that they would go back. So the Chinese term here is the overseas Chinese visiting India, sojourning, and this is how it shows up in many of the documents. And that's why the curriculum in schools was to teach them, once they go back, they will be able to integrate into the Chinese society, having the language, local language, and knowledge of the country. And the Republican propaganda documents that show up in the 30s and the 40s emphasize that these Chinese overseas should come back and help in the reconstruction of the country and the nation. So the idea that they belong to the greater China and this identity of a Chinese then really starts showing up. So the sub-dialect, local, regional, then merges into a nation-state framework in the later periods, because the nation gets involved in the overseas Chinese. Now, some of the overview of the Chinese community in India was mentioned by Ambassador Kanta, but here I think many of you perhaps know about this. The first Chinese to arrive that is documented in British sources is somebody who had a nickname called Achiu. He is supposed to have arrived in 1778. We know the exact date because there's a British document about him. And he was there when Warren Hastings was the governor in British India in Kolkata, and he was very much interested in procuring tea. At that time, the need for tea, or the import of tea in England had increased tremendously, and everybody in India was trying to figure out if tea can be grown in India as well. Warren Hastings was interested in tea. He actually plays a very important role in the beginning of tea industry in India. And he seems to have come across this person called Achiu, who gave him a present of large quantity of tea, and Warren Hastings gave him a horse and said, run around with the horse, and wherever the horse goes, that territory will belong to you. And he went around, and that area became, after his name, Achipur. So you can see this place near Calcutta. It's named after this person, Achiu, and he's supposed to have then established a sugar mill and started bringing Chinese laborers. So the coming of Chinese workers into India is nothing new. They have been coming and working on various kinds of projects before that. It is only in the 1800s, it seems, that Kolkata becomes the main destination. Again, the Chinese migrants wanting to work mostly for the British, not the Kolkata Bengalis. They, I think, didn't want to work for many of the Bengalis because, one, the Bengali ostracized many of these Chinese. They eat pork and beef. We Bengalis don't do that. I'm a Bengali, so I can say that. But the Chinese then complained that the Bengalis don't pay like the British do. So they prefer to work as carpenters for the British. The alliance was very clear that the Chinese and the British worked together at that time. 1901, the census that we have indicates that population was 1640. The Chinese migrants, and they lumped everybody together, and this is the beginning of the confusion and merging of all the distinctions that the Chinese community itself had. The British just created a monolithic Chinese community, which was in fact very diverse. By the end of World War II, and the number rises because when the Japanese occupied Malaya, Singapore, Malaysia, present day, many of these ethnic Chinese from that region take refuge in India, and the numbers increase rapidly. So the accounting, British kept account of all the foreigners in India at that time. 26,250 Chinese in India, in places Kolkata, Assam, Kalimpong, Bombay, and other places. In Kolkata present day, the numbers have declined, 2,000 to 3,000, we don't know. I don't think you have to put your ethnicity in the census now, so the numbers are declining, unfortunately. So this community has gone through various kinds of changes, and the changes have not always been Good. So these are the three sites of Chinese settlements in Kolkata. So Boj is at the very bottom, it's connected to Hooghly, and this is the outlet into the Bay of Bengal. The other two Chinatowns are in Bobajar and Tangra. Tangra being the later one, where the Hakkas went and bought tanneries so that they could make shoes cheaper and earn a profit by selling them. Huh? Achipur is the Boj area. Boj is where today is Achipur. Yeah, so that's further down south. That's the tomb of Achiu in red. We don't know if it's I don't know if anybody has excavated it to find a body or not. But this has become a pilgrimage site. Every Chinese New Year, which will happen next month, the Chinese community, not only in India but who have gone abroad, would go and worship it. There has been a tradition in Chinese community abroad that they would turn the first Chinese migrant, if known, into a deified image, the ancestor of overseas Chinese in a particular region. So Achu has become the ancestor deity of the Chinese in India. The one bottom is a very famous school, unfortunately closed, perhaps opening again. The Peme, one of the largest schools in Kolkata. There's a graveyard. There are about 6 or 7 graveyards in Kolkata of the Chinese. Each of these sub-dialect group would have their own separate graveyards. And that's another Chinese school. You'll see that there's an Indian flag, the picture of Gandhi and Sun Yat-sen. I'm told that initially they had a picture of Chiang Kai-shek, but after 49 they had to put Sun Yat-sen, a comfortable figure than Chiang Kai-shek. There are various kinds of very interesting institutions, and I'll recommend people to go and visit various parts of Kolkata, especially the Bobajar and Tangra. There are interesting architecture if you go inside, very interesting ways of worshipping various kinds of deities, and it's just a fascinating culture and society that we miss out. Just in case we just eat food, we miss out the diversity of culture as well. And I think it's worth studying how they have come out of a niche into the Bengali society in Kolkata. The Hoikwans, these are quite important. These are the associations that run graveyards. These are the associations that run schools. There were meeting places. Now marriages take place. People who are bored go and play mahjong in these Hoikwans. Still quite active in some of these Hoikwans, but the history of these Hoikwans you can see from 1838 onwards, and how they also run schools and graveyards is quite important. This is again to preserve the community. The sub-regional and the sub-dialect communities are based on these kinds of institutions that exist. But at the same time, they started creating something new, and this is again something common in many of the Chinese immigrant communities abroad. They bring their own culture and ideas, and then they integrate with locals. You can see the Ashoka emblem on the top. This is actually a temple belonging to a local person who was deified. And Chang Sing has written a very interesting article on this temple, which is something very, very localized worship that you see in this temple. It's the same with this one. I don't know, some of you perhaps know this. This is a Kali temple, where you have, of course, the Chinese cannot become a Hindu Brahmin as such, not yet. But this is the person who runs the ritual is an Indian, but most of the people who worship here are Chinese. They worship Kali here for fertility reasons, to have children. And this is one of the very famous Kali temple in Tangra. So they have localized their belief system as they have lived in India since 1778. These in 1959, before and this is in Chinese. Let me just explain. This is an important chart. This comes in one of the documents that were produced by Taiwan in 1959 about where all the Chinese in South Asia live. And here there's a category of I don't know if this works here of Han Chinese. After this, this is on the right column here. There's one on Uyghur, and at the last one is Tibetans. All are part of Chinese identity here. So the numbers are given in Calcutta, Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Jalpaiguri, and so forth. In 59, about 22,000 or so people still living, but they are bringing Tibetans and Uyghur inside. Remember, this is a document produced from Taiwan, not People's Republic of China in 59. So this identity, this issue of all these minorities together forming a Chinese nation is nothing just mainland, it's also Taiwan. But this is what Ambassador Kanta was talking about. It becomes a problem because none of these Chinese who came had documents when they arrived in India. In 49, when People's Republic of China was established and the first consulate of People's Republic of China opened in Kolkata, the consulate is supposed, I don't know if it's an urban legend or what, but they offered money to people who would want PRC passport. A number of them got PRC passport, and then Vinny can tell me, or Lawrence perhaps you can tell me, in exchange for loans from the Chinese consulate. And many of the laundries that opened up in Kolkata seem to have opened with that money at that time. But when this problems between PRC and Republic of India took place, the people who had passports, so here you said 2,000 have passports of PRC, these were the first ones to be arrested and deported. So you can see how these people then got affected by the deterioration of the relations between two nations. And this was all over the newspaper. This is from Statesman. You can see how these people were being deported, the Chinese nationals, right? I mean, but these included people who did not have passports. These were people, some of them were people who were born in India, did not have any passports, but they looked Chinese. This is the one definition: if your face looks Chinese, you are Chinese. So some of them were actually Nepalis, who were also deported, unfortunately. This is 62, 63. And then this is the internment. That this was perhaps the worst kind of treatment for these minorities. Again, the distinction is not made if they were Chinese with a Chinese passport or they looked Chinese. And this were arbitrarily taken together, sent to Deoli, and they lived there for 5 years. Ambassador Kanta mentioned, you see the children there. Some of them are actually born in the internment camp. I think here Rita will talk more about some of these people. She has actually interviewed many of them. But this is something that has become a huge issue among the Chinese community, and you see in the documentary as well of Rafiq Ilyas. This is a camp. This Deoli camp has a history of its own. Many of the independence leaders were also arrested here. Nehru was not here, but I see here Jayaprakash Narayan was in Deoli as well. Later on, Bangladeshis were put on here. Pakistani soldiers in the war in the 60s also were put in here. So many Chinese now go back, who were born here, go back and look at this place, Deoli. People have started writing about their experiences. I think these are important sources to understand it. In Marsh has a book doing time with Nehru. Of course, she is criticizing Nehru a lot. And there's a dissertation that was written in Toronto, the Deoli camp, on the oral history of this place from 62 to 66. These are both fascinating reads, people who have experienced the Deoli camp. They also have a Deoli camp committee in Toronto. This is in Toronto. These people lived at some point at Deoli, and so they have come. So you can see even if they are in Toronto, they are actually remembering their time in India. Even the times were bad. What brings them together in Toronto is nothing good, but they still come together. They also meet. I think Rita was involved with bringing this woman closer to her parents, and maybe she will talk about her. Her parents were deported. She herself remained in Assam, and she wanted to meet her parents. I think Rita plays an important role in bringing the family together. So there are such stories that unfortunately exist among the Chinese. The Chinese in Toronto meet in Tim Hortons. These are the Tangra tables. They are called Tangra tables in Toronto. And here again, the issue of identity comes up, how they are preserving this identity despite all these torments they went through in the 1960s. Almost every week, Saturday or Sunday, they would meet there and talk about Kolkata. talk about Assam. And I think this is a fascinating part of this. These are again from the Chinese village, the first photo I showed. They make samosas, they celebrate Diwali, they have really fascinating stories that they share with their children and grandchildren. So they try to preserve the memories, and unfortunately we have forgotten them. And when Gautam Bambewala, who is ambassador to Beijing now, was consul in Guangzhou, I had mentioned to him that these would be the people, if you really want to use soft power, to bring to India. And they long from Assam. They want to go back to Assam. They want to come to Kolkata and see these places. These would be people to bring back. Whatever we have done, this may be the way to address that issue, to bring them back in. So here, I'll just end with a couple of slides about these multiple identities and belongings. Now these people, sometimes they would call Chinese Indian, and Paul Chung said it is Indian Chinese because Indian nationality, Chinese ethnicity. But many of them don't have Indian nationality. They're getting a passport. Perhaps Lawrence, you can talk about when the Chinese could become citizens. But those who migrated to Toronto are hyphenated again, Indian, Chinese, Canadian. And then those who are in China call themselves Chinese, Indian, Chinese. One thing common here is the Indian aspect, right? So no matter where you are, these people have not forgotten their Indian identity, which they use to separate themselves from others wherever they are located. So the place also matters to assert their identity. Now, they also have multiple belongings, just like the terms they are using. They have ancestral land wherever they come from sub-region of Guangdong. A site in Kolkata or in Assam or Darjeeling or Kalimpong, that is also where they belong to. Now many of them live in Toronto, about 10,000 of them. That's now their belonging. Some of them live in these villages, continue to live in these villages in China. They identify their belonging now to that place. New sites of migration, they are continuously moving. Many people go to Australia even today. So they seem to have many places to belong to, but they don't have a single place that they belong. And that's a dilemma they face. They can say that they have been in different regions, but no single place that accepts them properly. Even in China, they are discriminated by the Han Chinese. I would just recommend, if you are really interested, 2 volumes that have come up. Chang Xing's book, The Chinese Community in Calcutta, Preservation and Change, is perhaps the most detailed study of this community. Actually looks at various interesting aspects, temples, schools, and so forth. The Indian and Chinese immigrant communities is a comparison between the Chinese abroad and the Indians abroad. So this is to create a new framework where the Indian overseas and the Chinese overseas and their livelihood and the issues of identity and belongings are addressed. I think these 2 are important studies that we can look at. And finally, this is a CHA project that we have started from Singapore, is to revive the Chinatown, and Vinny knows about this, is to create a heritage walk within the Chinese Chinatown or temples and schools, so that people who do not know about the Chinese community could go and take a look at what they have created over the last 200 years or so. They are part of the Chinese, are part of the Indian tradition, and we should recognize them. Thank you. Hopefully some of these will be coming up later, and people will talk about some of these issues. What we'll do now is look at this wonderful, it's a 25 minutes documentary by Rafiq Ilyas called The Legend of Fat Mama, and many of the issues that I talked about will show up here. And it's a moving, touching documentary done in 25 minutes. It was shown on BBC first. And we have been doing this India-Chinese events all over the world, it seems. And then we show this documentary where we go, and we'll come back and do the first 3 presentations. We'll make a break. There are 6 presentations, I think. It's just too long. So you may have Q&A. So maybe we'll have a Q&A in between, and then we'll do the last 3 presentations, if that's okay with you.